Good morning and welcome to the big story here on the BDT Breakfast Show. My name is Elizabeth Musa. This morning, we turn our focus to a growing crisis that's touching every corner of the country. The rising wave of insecurity and how it's threatening not just safety, but also the cost of living, food security, and Nigeria's broader economy. From farmers being displaced in key food producing regions to transporters rerouting through longer, costlier paths. The ripple effects are severe. And then there's the impact of policy shifts, climate disruptions, and a currency in free fall, all colliding to push prices up and productivity down. Well, joining us this morning to unpack all of this is someone who's been tracking these trends very closely and in real time. Ikemeset F. Young is the managing partner and head of research at SBM Intelligence. Ikemeset, it's great to have you on the show this morning.
Good morning, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me.
Very lovely to have you this morning. Now, the latest SBM Jollof Index shows the real cost of this crisis, and it's looking like it's more than just economic. Let's start with what you're seeing right now. How big of a role is insecurity playing in the rising cost of food and living in Nigeria?
By our assessment, a significant one, right? So, insecurity impacts disproportionately the country's main food-growing regions. And so if you look at, the more central portions of Nigeria, parts of the north, the single parts of the northwest, they account for the significant amounts of Nigeria's arable land, a decent chunk of its production, of its crop and food production, right? And a lot of the farmland, right, has been shut in, right, by a combination of the security situation that we have, which has meant that lots of farmers have not been able to farm. The few who have been able to, right, are carrying out production under exceptional circumstances. They are subject to extra legal levies and charges. They're essentially paying. We have seen evidence in parts of the country where farmers pay protection money to gangs, to bandit groups, to jihadist groups, in order for them to be able to, to access their farms and essentially create a living for themselves. And 80 cents amount of food production is diverted, and sometimes these levies are paid in kind, they are paid in produce as well. And then you also have a situation where even in a non even even in a calmer security paradigm, right, the level of infrastructure, the level of supply chain support, the quality of access routes to uh, to farmland and by extension, right, the pipeline to getting this produce to markets and to the middle of a centers, places like Lagos, Abuja, and the likes, right, is significantly impaired, right? But security accounts for, and with the Jollof Index, we track food inflation, not just in Nigeria, but in Ghana as well. And when you look at the differential between food inflation in Nigeria and food inflation in Ghana, food inflation in Ghana is more responsive to macroeconomic and challenges, whether they are domestic. So, for example, the situation with their currency, the situation with the debt situation that they have there, or it's global macro. You think the war in Ukraine, you think oil prices and all of that, right? The food inflation indicators, even the Jollof Index indicators, right, are a lot more cyclical and they're a lot more volatile. But with Nigerian food inflation, it's just largely been an upward trend. Now, the rates at which prices have been increasing is slowing, but it's still rising. And it's because of, the bigger structural issues that Nigeria is dealing with. And one of the primary ones is insecurity. And that's where it's exacting a real cost, right, in the pockets of most Nigerian households.
All right, so give us what the numbers are actually showing, especially like Bauchi, where food inflation is really high. What are the numbers saying at the moment?
Yeah, so we have a situation now where right now to cook a pot of jollof rice for a family of five, which is the National Bureau of Statistics mean for the average Nigerian household is north of 27,500 right now. as context, when we started doing the Jollof Index in 2016, that number was around 4,300 naira, right? So it's exponentially increased, right, in a little over nine years, right? And we track we track food inflation in 8 Nigerian cities and in 13 markets, right? And within those cities. And what you see in places like Bauchi, where, for example, the cost of pepper has risen by 300% just between Q3 2024, when we did the Jollof Index, and sort of now, right, in Q2 2025, excuse me. You have a situation where the cost of pepper has risen 300%. And that's largely, a local micro issue, right? So, Bauchi itself is not as impacted security-wise as a lot of its neighbors, even though it has its own fair share of security challenges, right? But the markets where we track the prices in Bauchi gets a lot of their produce, not just from surrounding farming communities right in Bauchi, but also from neighboring states that are more security impacted, right? You think Yobe, you think Plateau, you think Adamawa to a lesser extent, you think Gombe as well, right? And because of that, the cost of getting produce right to markets in Bauchi specifically, right, have become that much more elevated, and you're seeing that in the end price of things like peppers and tomatoes and onions as well. And that really is the story, right, of the Jollof Index, which is that there is a wider national macroeconomic story that it tells, but in each of the various cities where we track prices, there's also a next layer and conversation that the numbers and the data, right, is essentially showing us. The other key thing I suppose to highlight, right, about the Jollof Index is that food security right now in Nigeria has passed a critical threshold. We now have a situation where most Nigerian households are stressed from a spending standpoint, but particularly from a food spending standpoint, right? The number of Nigerian households that we are seeing that come under enormous financial stress, right, is increasing, and it's increasing exponentially. This is in effect a crisis at this point, and it behoves of policymakers to really accord this the level of seriousness and the level of attention, right, that it requires, because there could be significant social repercussions that could emanate if this problem is not adequately tackled.
Now let's speak about the naira in itself, which has been sliding for months. Can we attest it? Can we tie it in any way to how that's directly affecting the price of food in markets right now?
Well, it was more of a significant issue in sort of Q3, Q4, and maybe into the early parts of Q1 and 2025, about Q3 and Q4 of last year, right, where we saw that that very significant jump in the value of the dollar relative to the naira. Now the naira has stabilized somewhat against major currencies, obviously at a much higher price point. And so you have a situation now where most of the costs that could have been passed on to the end consumer as a result of a much weaker currency, we think has largely been passed on now. That doesn't mean that the naira isn't still a factor, right? Especially in terms of pricing, in terms of pricing, in terms of the value of imported inputs and significant amounts of rice, despite policy setting to the contrary, still remains important, and still remains imported, right? And so there's a foreign currency component to that story there. But to our minds, right, the more clear and present factor, apart from insecurity, is actually the cost of fuel, right? Because that significantly impacts um, the the price point at which producers are able to take um, produce to markets now, because the price of fuel has significantly increased as a result of deregulation and the end of the fuel and subsidy program in the upstream sector. You now have a situation where it's that much more expensive to get things to market, and and because the pricing of fuel is dynamic, so depending on the latest dispatch, either from the Dangote refinery and the associated stations that get their vending from them, or from the NNPC, and also the retail stations that get their vending from the NNPC, that could significantly alter the price of key food items, right? And the price point at which they get to the market. So we think that's more of a factor now, seeing that the naira is a little bit more stable.
Mentioned, fuel subsidies impacted how the prices of food in terms of transporting from farms to cities. But let's also talk about the impact of climate and flooding, droughts, unpredictable seasons, and all of that. How's that making things even worse for food producers?
I mean, it's definitely exacting a cost, right? The the West African monsoon season, I mean, call it rainy season, right down here, is a little bit more unstable than than what it typically has been historically. So in certain parts of the country, it's not raining as often, but when it does rain, it's a significant downpour. We saw flooding last year and significantly impair the the production from a volumetric but also from a qualitative standpoint for goods like cocoa, for goods like for crops like oil palm, right, and the rest. There was a significant tomato shortage at some point last year, and it was climate change driven, because a lot of the main tomato producing areas were underwater as a result of significant flooding in the River Niger, but also the River Benue and basin, where a lot of our food is grown anyway. So yes, and we've also seen, right, from the data that we compare for the Jollof Index, that in certain markets, right, the flooding season, and at this point it's really an annual thing right now. So it's probably best to classify it as what it is, which is the season, right? Means that certain food items are essentially taken offline, or they come to market at a much later date. The quantity is often smaller. The size and the quantity of the produce is often smaller, because you need big to capture whatever demand is out there. Farmers may be harvesting crops a little bit early, and so the sizes of this food inputs is not as large as what you would have seen 3, 4, 5 odd years ago, right? And so you have a situation, and then we have heard from qualitative sampling of market growers that just the general quality of produce appears to be coming down, and there's a bit of a climate change story that is impacting that as well. The quality of the quality of produce, right, is significant. Soil composition, soil types, right, appear to be changing in a way that is climate change driven, right? But unfortunately, the climate change conversation, right, in Nigeria is still at a point right now where people don't think it is a clear and present reality, but it's often represented as a future concern. And so from that standpoint, you do have a situation where to our minds, climate change continues to remain a significant factor, and one that is likely to get even more significant and occupy a more prominent role, right, in how Nigerian agriculture, right, is shaped. And so and so the premise of your question, right, this is a very important one, which is that climate change is very important and it's becoming even more important in shaping our food security dynamics.
So in your opinion, do you think we're doing enough on the policy side, or are some of the government's interventions adding to this problem?
I'm not sure we're doing enough, right? So, over the last two administrations, right, we've pursued essentially a food self-sufficiency strategy. And I think it's very important to distinguish between food security and food self-sufficiency. So food security essentially prioritizes the availability of food at the lowest or the most affordable and possible cost for the most number of people. Now, whether that is sourced domestically or imports is a very important contributor to food security. The most important thing is food available to the most number of people at the most affordable prices, right? Food self-sufficiency, on the other hand, prioritizes you producing as much of what you consume, right, domestically, irrespective of the price point. And what we're seeing is that, all of these structural issues that continue to dynamically affect Nigerian agriculture and by extension, right, the food security of most Nigerians, are amplified by pursuing a food self-sufficiency strategy. In a situation where climate change and insecurity and currency weakness and the rising cost of logistics and supply chains makes it more expensive to grow food at scale in Nigeria for most Nigerians at an affordable price point, I think it's best to switch to a food security strategy, at least in the medium term. And so in that sense, policymaking could do a better job. Policymaking is still stuck in a food self-sufficiency mindset, which is not altogether bad if you were doing a lot more to address insecurity, logistics and supply chains, currency, stability, and all of the other issues, infrastructure, and all of the other issues that continue to negatively impact Nigerian agriculture. We are not doing as much as we should on any of those, line items, as it were. And so Nigerians are paying for that exponentially when they do their grocery shopping. And so my sense is that in the short to medium term, let's prioritize food security. Let's support lower income Nigerian households to be able to put food on the table. We're seeing the disappearance, for example, of protein sources from many Nigerian households. Many Nigerian households are rationalizing how many times they eat meat, they eat fish, because the cost of protein has just shot up and skyrocketed. Domestic production can't keep up, and foreign imports, right, are now happening at a much higher price points because of that currency weakness that we talked about much earlier. The government can do more in terms of maybe temporarily waiving some import levies and charges for specific food items, right? So that puts downward pressure on the end price of proteins, and you have a situation where more Nigerians can afford to have meat or have fish as part of their regular diet. So policymaking can definitely be more nimble. It can definitely do more. I don't think that it has it has as much carrying power, right, in terms of its track record as it should, right? And I think there's still a lot that we're leaving on the table that we can do just to make life that little bit much easier for most Nigerians.
Thank you for speaking on, you spoke about structure and then infrastructure in itself. So looking ahead now, Ikemesa, do you see any signs that things might start to ease, or are we likely to see this inflation level stay for a while?
So like I said earlier, and what we're seeing with the Jollof Index, what you're seeing even with the NBS's own food inflation numbers is that yes, the rate of price increases is rising, but it's not rising as quickly as it was in the past. So that, at least statistically, gives us some room, right, for comfort. Unfortunately, for most Nigerians, right, they would still interpret, they will still, their their lived experience will still be of price increases, right? Whether it's slowing or otherwise, unless you begin to see prices move in the opposite direction, right? Nigerians will still continue to feel like they are in a high inflationary environment, and they would have just cause, right, for feeling that. But our sort of medium term horizon is that is that food inflation, right, begins to soften a little bit, and even if those numbers continue to rise. I think one point that I should probably just highlight in summation is that you're now seeing a decoupling between headline inflation and food inflation. Headline inflation is slowing much faster than food inflation. Food inflation is generally more volatile, and it's more of a laggard, right? So the margin, right, the spread between headline and food inflation is still too elevated, right, for my comfort levels. I would argue for the comfort levels of most Nigerian budgets right now, and I think we'll still see a bit more of that over the next couple of quarters. But certainly the rate, barring any significant macroeconomic shock, maybe a sharp spike in the in the in the price of crude, for example, and that in a deregulated fuel environment, the sharp rise in the price of global crude will obviously mean that domestic fuel prices will increase, and that will have an impact immediately on food inflation, but maybe more broadly on headline inflation. So barring that, we think that slowing trend in those price increases will continue over the next couple of quarters. And maybe by mid 2026, all things being told, we will begin to see food inflation slowly begin to come down from this elevated levels.
All right. Thank you very much, Ikemesit F. Young, Managing Partner and Head of Research at SBM Intelligence, for joining us for this insightful conversation this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, this has been The Big Story on the BDTV Breakfast Show. Up next is social listening. Do stay with us.